Picture this. You're trapped in a dark, echoing cave, the air thick with the stench of sheep and the faint glow of a fire. Across from you looms a towering figure, its single, unblinking eye fixed on you with a mix of curiosity and menace. This is no ordinary giant. This is Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and you're about to witness one of the most legendary encounters in Greek mythology. But what if everything you thought you knew about the Cyclopes was wrong? What if these one-eyed beings were far more complex, misunderstood, and fascinating than the tales of terror suggest? Welcome to the world of the Cyclopes, creatures that have captured imaginations for thousands of years. Often reduced to monstrous villains or simple brutes, the Cyclopes are so much more than the myths we've been told. In this video, we're diving deep into Greek legend to debunk 25 of the most persistent myths about these enigmatic beings. From their misunderstood roles in the divine battles of the gods to their surprising skills as master craftsmen, we'll uncover the truth behind the legends. So, if you've ever wondered why the Cyclopes were feared, revered, or even misunderstood, you're in the right place. By the end of this video, you'll see these one-eyed wonders in a whole new light. Ready to separate fact from fiction? Let's begin. Now, let's tackle the first myth head-on, the idea that all Cyclopes were towering, hulking giants. While it's true that figures like Polyphemus from Homer's Odyssey were depicted as massive and intimidating, not all Cyclopes fit this description. In fact, the portrayal of Cyclopes varies significantly depending on the source. For instance, in HESIOD'S THEOGONY, the Cyclopes Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges are described as skilled craftsmen who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. While they were undoubtedly powerful, their size wasn't emphasized as overwhelmingly gigantic. Instead, their strength lay in their craftsmanship and divine connection, not just their physical stature. This contrast between Homer's and HESIOD'S depictions highlights how myths can evolve and diverge. In some stories, Cyclopes are larger-than-life figures, while in others, they're closer to human proportions, with their single eye and unique abilities being their defining traits. So, while the image of a towering Cyclops might dominate popular imagination, it's important to remember that these beings were far more varied in their appearances and roles. This diversity in their portrayal reminds us that myths are rarely one size fits all. They're shaped by the storytellers, their cultures, and the purposes behind the tales. With this myth debunked, we're ready to explore another layer of the Cyclope story, one that challenges the idea that they were universally violent and savage. But more on that next. Now, let's move on to another fascinating myth about the Cyclopes, the belief that they were all violent and savage creatures. While figures like Polyphemus, who famously clashed with Odysseus, might come to mind as examples of their brutality, this stereotype doesn't hold true for all Cyclopes. In fact, their roles in Greek mythology are far more nuanced than this one-dimensional portrayal suggests. Take, for instance, the Cyclopes Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges, who played a crucial role in the Titanomachy, the epic battle between the Olympian gods and the Titans. These Cyclopes were not savage monsters but skilled craftsmen and allies of Zeus. They forged his mighty thunderbolts, weapons that helped secure victory for the Olympians. Without their craftsmanship and loyalty, the balance of power in Greek mythology might have looked very different. This contrast between the helpful Cyclopes of the Titanomachy and the more aggressive Polyphemus highlights how their portrayal often depended on the specific story being told. Polyphemus's violence, for example, was tied to his role as an antagonist in Odysseus's journey, serving as a test of the hero's cunning and resourcefulness. But this doesn't mean all Cyclopes were inherently hostile. Instead, their behavior often reflected the needs of the narrative, whether it was to showcase divine craftsmanship or to create a formidable obstacle for a hero to overcome. So, while the image of a savage Cyclops might dominate certain tales, it's important to recognize that these beings were not universally violent. their roles in Greek mythology were as varied as the stories themselves, ranging from divine allies to fearsome adversaries. This complexity reminds us that myths are rarely black and white. They're filled with shades of gray, shaped by the storytellers and the contexts in which they were told. With this myth addressed, we're ready to explore another layer of the Cyclops story, one that delves into the origins of their most iconic feature, the single eye. But more on that next. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most iconic features of the Cyclops, their single eye. This defining characteristic has become so deeply ingrained in our image of these creatures that it's hard to imagine them any other way. But where did this myth originate, and why has it endured for so long? The single eye of the Cyclopes likely stems from their earliest depictions in Greek mythology. In Homer's Odyssey, Polyphemus is described as having one large eye in the center of his forehead, a detail that has since become synonymous with Cyclopes in popular culture. This striking visual made them instantly recognizable and added to their aura of otherworldly menace. But the single eye wasn't just a physical trait, it carried symbolic weight as well. In Greek mythology, the single eye often represented a focus on singular vision or purpose. For the Cyclopes, this could symbolize their mastery of craftsmanship, as seen in their ability to forge Zeus's thunderbolts with precision and skill. The single eye might also reflect their isolation or detachment from the world, emphasizing their role as beings set apart from both gods and mortals. Interestingly, not all depictions of Cyclopes adhered to the single-eye myth. In some lesser-known stories and artistic representations, Cyclopes were shown with multiple eyes or even other unique features. For example, certain vase paintings and regional myths describe Cyclopes with 2 or 3 eyes, suggesting that their appearance varied depending on the storyteller or cultural context. These variations remind us that myths are fluid, shaped by the imaginations and needs of those who told them. The single eye also holds broader symbolic meaning in Greek mythology. It can be seen as a metaphor for insight, clarity, or even a kind of divine vision. In this sense, the Cyclops' single eye might represent their connection to the divine or their ability to see what others cannot. This interpretation adds another layer of depth to their character, moving them beyond mere monsters and into the realm of complex, multifaceted beings. So, while the single eye has become the defining feature of the Cyclopes, it's worth remembering that their mythology is far more varied and nuanced than this one detail suggests. Whether they had one eye, 2, or even more, the Cyclopes remain some of the most fascinating and enigmatic figures in Greek legend. With this myth explored, we're ready to uncover another layer of their story, one that challenges the idea that Cyclopes were always solitary creatures. But more on that next. Now, let's shift our focus to another widely held belief about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were solitary creatures, living in isolation away from both gods and mortals. While this image of a lone Cyclops like Polyphemus has become iconic, it doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, the Cyclopes were far more social and collaborative than this myth suggests. Take, for example, the 3 Cyclopes known as Brontes, Steropes, and Arges. These brothers were not only skilled craftsmen, but also worked together as a team to create some of the most powerful weapons in Greek mythology. They were the masterminds behind Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades's helmet of invisibility. Their ability to collaborate and combine their talents highlights a side of the Cyclopes that often goes unnoticed, their capacity for teamwork and shared purpose. This collaborative spirit wasn't limited to their work for the gods. In some myths, Cyclopes were also credited with building massive structures, such as the walls of Mycenae, which were said to be so grand that only giants could have constructed them. These stories suggest that Cyclopes weren't just lone wanderers but could come together to achieve extraordinary feats. The myth of their solitude likely stems from their portrayal in certain tales, like Polyphemus's isolated existence in his cave. However, even in these stories, their isolation often serves a narrative purpose, emphasizing their otherness or the challenges faced by heroes like Odysseus. It's important to remember that myths are shaped by the needs of the storyteller, and the image of the solitary Cyclops may have been exaggerated to fit specific themes or lessons. By exploring these collaborative roles, we see a more nuanced picture of the Cyclopes, one where they are not just solitary monsters, but skilled artisans and builders who work together to shape the world of gods and mortals alike. This challenges the stereotype of the lone Cyclops and invites us to reconsider their place in Greek mythology. With this myth debunked, we're ready to explore another layer of their story, one that examines their relationship with the gods and whether they were always enemies. But more on that next. Now, let's turn our attention to another fascinating myth about the Cyclopes, the belief that they were always enemies of the gods. This idea paints them as perpetual adversaries locked in conflict with the divine. But as we've seen with other myths, the truth is far more layered. In fact, the Cyclopes played a pivotal role in one of the most significant events in Greek mythology, the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympian gods. When Zeus sought to overthrow his father, Cronus, and the Titans, he needed powerful allies. Enter the Cyclopes. These skilled craftsmen forged the thunderbolts that became Zeus's signature weapon, giving him the edge he needed to defeat the Titans. Without their help, the balance of power might have looked very different. This collaboration wasn't just a one-time deal either. The Cyclopes continued to support the gods, crafting other legendary weapons like Poseidon's trident and Hades' helmet of invisibility. Far from being enemies, they were indispensable allies in the gods' rise to power. But their relationship with the gods wasn't always smooth. Like any alliance, it had its complexities. For instance, some myths suggest that the Cyclopes were imprisoned by Cronus, the very titan Zeus sought to overthrow. This shared enemy may have been the foundation of their partnership. Yet, even after the Titanomachy, their interactions with the gods weren't purely harmonious. There are tales of conflicts and misunderstandings, but these were exceptions rather than the rule. The myth of their eternal enmity likely stems from their portrayal in specific stories, like Polyphemus's clash with Odysseus, where the Cyclops is pitted against a hero favored by the gods. However, these narratives often serve to highlight the hero's cunning or the god's favor, rather than reflect the broader relationship between Cyclopes and deities. By examining their role in the Titanomachy and their ongoing contributions to the god's arsenal, we see a more nuanced picture. The Cyclopes were not mere enemies but vital collaborators whose skills and loyalty shaped the very fabric of Greek mythology. This challenges the simplistic view of them as adversaries and invites us to appreciate the complexity of their place in the divine order. With this myth unraveled, we're ready to explore another layer of their story, one that delves into their intelligence and craftsmanship, debunking the idea that they were primitive and unintelligent. But more on that next. Now, let's tackle another widespread misconception about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were primitive and unintelligent. This myth paints them as brutish and simple-minded, but the reality couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the Cyclopes were master craftsmen, renowned for their extraordinary skills in blacksmithing and craftsmanship. Their work wasn't just functional, it was legendary, shaping the very tools and structures that defined Greek mythology. Take, for example, their role in creating some of the most iconic weapons of the gods. As we've already seen, they forged Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helmet of invisibility. These weren't just ordinary tools, they were symbols of divine power, crafted with precision and artistry. The Cyclopes' ability to create such weapons demonstrates not only their technical expertise, but also their deep understanding of the materials they worked with and the needs of their divine patrons. But their talents didn't stop at weaponry. The Cyclopes were also credited with building some of the most impressive structures in ancient Greece. One of the most famous examples is the walls of Mycenae, a city known for its massive Cyclopean masonry. These walls, made of enormous stone blocks fitted together without mortar, were so impressive that later generations believed only giants like the Cyclopes could have built them. This architectural marvel stands as a testament to their ingenuity and skill, challenging the notion that they were primitive or lacking in intelligence. What's more, their craftsmanship wasn't just about brute strength. It required careful planning, problem-solving, and a deep knowledge of engineering principles. The Cyclops' ability to manipulate massive stones and forge intricate weapons suggests a level of sophistication that goes far beyond the stereotype of mindless giants. So, why does the myth of their unintelligence persist? Part of it may stem from their portrayal in certain stories, like Polyphemus's encounter with Odysseus, where the Cyclops is outwitted by the clever hero. But these tales often focus on the hero's cunning rather than the Cyclops' true nature. When we look at their broader contributions to Greek mythology, it's clear that they were far from primitive. They were skilled artisans whose work played a crucial role in the divine and mortal worlds alike. By debunking this myth, we gain a deeper appreciation for the Cyclops' intelligence and creativity. Their legacy as master craftsmen reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and that even the most misunderstood creatures can hold surprising depths. With this myth unraveled, we're ready to explore another fascinating aspect of the Cyclopes, their presence beyond the borders of Greece, but more on that next. Now, let's shift our focus beyond the borders of Greece and explore another intriguing myth about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were unique to Greek mythology. While the Cyclopes are most famously associated with Greek legends, similar one-eyed giants appear in mythologies around the world, suggesting a fascinating cross-cultural connection. In Norse mythology, for instance, there are tales of one-eyed beings like the giant Hrungnir, who wielded a massive stone weapon and was known for his immense strength. Though not identical to the Cyclopes, Hrungnir shares their imposing stature and association with raw power. Similarly, in Hindu mythology, the figure of the one-eyed demon Kabandha appears in the epic Ramayana. Kabandha, though more monstrous in nature, echoes the Cyclops' single eye and larger-than-life presence. These parallels raise an interesting question. Why do so many cultures feature one-eyed giants in their myths? One possibility is that these stories reflect shared human experiences or universal fears. The idea of a towering, single-eyed creature might symbolize the unknown or the overwhelming forces of nature, a theme that resonates across different societies. Alternatively, these myths could stem from ancient encounters with fossils or geological formations that resembled giant skulls with a single eye socket, sparking the imagination of early storytellers. Another theory suggests that these myths traveled along trade routes, spreading from one culture to another and evolving along the way. The Mediterranean, for example, was a hub of cultural exchange, and it's possible that stories of the Cyclopes influenced or were influenced by tales from neighboring regions. This blending of myths highlights the interconnectedness of ancient civilizations and their shared fascination with larger-than-life beings. By examining these cross-cultural connections, we gain a broader perspective on the Cyclopes and their place in world mythology. They're not just a Greek phenomenon, but part of a larger tapestry of stories that reflect humanity's collective imagination. This myth, like so many others, reminds us that the boundaries between cultures are often more porous than we think, and that myths have a way of transcending time and place. With this myth debunked, we're ready to dive into another layer of the Cyclops story, one that challenges the assumption that they were always male. But more on that next. Now, let's turn our attention to a myth that challenges one of the most deeply ingrained assumptions about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always male. While the majority of Cyclopes in Greek mythology are depicted as male, there are intriguing hints in lesser-known myths that suggest female Cyclopes may have existed, even if they rarely took center stage. In some obscure tales, there are references to female Cyclopes who played roles in the crafting of divine weapons or the building of monumental structures. These stories, though not as widely known as those of their male counterparts, offer a glimpse into a more nuanced understanding of these legendary beings. For example, one fragmentary myth mentions a female Cyclops who worked alongside the three famous brothers Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges in forging Zeus's thunderbolts. While her name and story have been largely lost to time, her existence hints at a broader diversity within Cyclopean lore. This raises an important question: why are female Cyclopes so rarely mentioned in the myths we know today? One possibility is that ancient Greek society, like many others, often emphasized male figures in its stories, reflecting the patriarchal values of the time. Female characters, when they did appear, were frequently relegated to supporting roles or portrayed in ways that reinforced traditional gender roles. This cultural bias may have led to the erasure or marginalization of female Cyclopes in the myths that have survived. Another angle to consider is the symbolic significance of the Cyclopes themselves. Their association with raw power, craftsmanship, and divine favor often aligned with traits traditionally viewed as masculine in ancient cultures. This might explain why male Cyclopes dominate the narratives, while female Cyclopes, if they existed, were either overlooked or reinterpreted to fit societal expectations. However, the presence of female Cyclopes, even in fragmented myths, reminds us that mythology is rarely as monolithic as it seems. These stories were shaped by countless storytellers over centuries, each adding their own interpretations and biases. By acknowledging the possibility of female Cyclopes, we open the door to a richer, more inclusive understanding of these legendary beings, one that reflects the diversity and complexity of the human imagination. With this myth explored, we're ready to move on to another fascinating aspect of Cyclopean lore, one that challenges the idea that they were always antagonists. But more on that next. Now let's shift our focus to a myth that flips the script on how we view the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always antagonists. While figures like Polyphemus, the Cyclops who famously clashed with Odysseus, have cemented the image of Cyclopes as villains in popular imagination, this isn't the full picture. In fact, many Cyclopes played crucial roles as helpers and creators, far removed from the savage, one-eyed monsters we often imagine. Take, for example, the three Cyclopes Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges who were instrumental in the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympian gods. These Cyclopes were not enemies of the gods but rather their allies, crafting the thunderbolts that Zeus used to overthrow the Titans. Their skill as blacksmiths and craftsmen was unparalleled, and their contributions were vital to the Olympians' victory. Without their help, the balance of power in Greek mythology might have looked very different. Similarly, Cyclopes were often depicted as builders of monumental structures, such as the massive walls of Mycenae, which were said to be so grand that only giants could have constructed them. These stories paint the Cyclopes not as mindless brutes but as skilled artisans whose work shaped the very foundations of the ancient world. Their association with craftsmanship and creation challenges the stereotype of them being purely destructive or antagonistic. So why does the image of the Cyclopes as villains persist? Much of it comes down to the enduring popularity of Homer's Odyssey, where Polyphemus is portrayed as a violent, cannibalistic figure. This single story has overshadowed the many other myths where Cyclopes are depicted in a more positive light. It's a reminder that mythology is often shaped by the stories that capture the public's imagination, sometimes at the expense of a more nuanced understanding. But even within the story of Polyphemus, there's room for interpretation. Some scholars argue that his actions, while brutal, were driven by a sense of justice. After all, Odysseus and his men were trespassing in his home. This doesn't excuse his behavior, but it does add a layer of complexity to his character, showing that even the most infamous Cyclops wasn't a one-dimensional villain. By exploring these different roles, we see that the Cyclopes were far more than just antagonists. They were creators, allies, and skilled craftsmen whose contributions to Greek mythology were as significant as they were varied. This myth reminds us that even the most misunderstood figures in legend often have more to their story than meets the eye. With this perspective in mind, let's move on to another intriguing aspect of Cyclopean lore, one that explores whether these beings were truly immortal. But more on that next. Now, let's turn our attention to a fascinating myth that challenges the idea of Cyclopes as immortal beings. While they are often depicted as powerful and otherworldly, the truth is that Cyclopes were not invincible. In fact, several myths tell of Cyclopes meeting their end at the hands of gods or heroes, revealing a more nuanced understanding of their nature. One of the most striking examples comes from the story of Apollo, the god of the sun and prophecy. According to legend, Apollo sought revenge on the Cyclopes after they forged the thunderbolt that Zeus used to kill his son, Asclepius. In his grief and anger, Apollo hunted down and killed the Cyclopes responsible, showing that even these formidable beings were not beyond the reach of divine retribution. This myth highlights the vulnerability of Cyclopes and underscores the fact that they were not truly immortal. Another example can be found in the tale of the hero Odysseus, who famously blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus. While Polyphemus survived the encounter, his defeat at the hands of a mortal hero further challenges the idea of Cyclopes as invincible. These stories remind us that in Greek mythology, the line between mortal and immortal was often blurred. Even beings with extraordinary powers could fall, whether to the wrath of the gods or the cunning of mortals. This raises an interesting question. If Cyclopes weren't immortal, what exactly were they? Greek mythology is filled with beings who occupy a middle ground between mortal and divine. Cyclopes, with their immense strength and unique abilities, seem to fit into this category. They were not gods, but they were far more than ordinary mortals. Their deaths at the hands of gods and heroes suggest that they were bound by certain limitations, even if those limitations were far beyond what most humans could comprehend. The idea of Cyclopes as mortal beings adds another layer to their already complex mythology. It reminds us that even the most powerful figures in legend were not without their vulnerabilities. This myth invites us to reconsider our assumptions about immortality in Greek mythology and to appreciate the intricate balance between power and mortality that defines so many of its stories. As we continue to unravel the myths surrounding the Cyclopes, let's explore another intriguing aspect of their lore, one that examines their connections to the gods beyond Zeus. But more on that next. Now, let's shift our focus to another intriguing myth about the Cyclopes, one that challenges the idea that they were solely tied to Zeus. While Zeus is perhaps the most famous god associated with the Cyclopes, thanks to their role in forging his thunderbolts, their connections to other deities reveal a much richer and more complex relationship with the divine. Take Poseidon, for example, the god of the sea. In some myths, the Cyclops Polyphemus is described as the son of Poseidon, linking these one-eyed giants to the watery realms of the ocean. This connection not only expands the Cyclops' mythological reach, but also ties them to the unpredictable and often chaotic nature of the sea. Polyphemus's role in the Odyssey, where he becomes a formidable obstacle for Odysseus, further emphasizes this bond, as Poseidon's wrath plays a central part in the hero's journey. But the Cyclops' divine connections don't end there. Hephaestus, the god of fire and blacksmithing, also shares a close relationship with these skilled craftsmen. In some versions of the myths, the Cyclopes are said to have worked alongside Hephaestus in his forge, creating not only Zeus's thunderbolts but also other legendary weapons and artifacts for the gods. This partnership highlights their expertise and importance in the divine order, showcasing them as more than just servants of Zeus. Even Apollo, the god of the sun and prophecy, has a connection to the Cyclopes, albeit a tragic one. As we've already seen, Apollo's vengeance against the Cyclopes for their role in Asclepius's death reveals a darker side to their divine relationships. This story underscores the complexity of their interactions with the gods, showing that their ties were not always harmonious or straightforward. These diverse connections paint a picture of the Cyclopes as integral figures in the broader tapestry of Greek mythology. Far from being limited to Zeus, they played significant roles in the stories of multiple gods, each relationship adding a new layer to their mythological identity. Whether as allies, creators, or even adversaries, the Cyclopes were deeply woven into the divine narratives of ancient Greece. As we continue to explore the myths surrounding these fascinating beings, let's turn our attention to another aspect of their lore, one that examines the origins of their iconic single eye. But more on that next. Now, let's take a closer look at one of the most iconic features of the Cyclopes, their single eye. While it's easy to assume that Cyclopes were always born with one eye, the truth is far more fascinating. In some myths, their single eye wasn't a natural trait, but rather the result of divine intervention or magical transformation. For instance, one lesser-known interpretation suggests that the Cyclopes' single eye was a punishment from the gods. According to this version, they were originally born with two eyes, but a curse or divine act stripped them of one, leaving them with their distinctive appearance. This idea adds a layer of tragedy to their story, framing their single eye as a mark of their suffering rather than an inherent feature. Another intriguing theory ties the Cyclopes' single eye to their role as master craftsmen. Some myths propose that their eye was a gift, not a curse, a magical enhancement that allowed them to see with unparalleled precision. This interpretation aligns with their reputation as skilled blacksmiths, suggesting that their single eye gave them the ability to craft divine weapons with unmatched accuracy. Interestingly, there are even stories where the Cyclops' single eye was a result of their own choices. In these tales, they willingly sacrificed one eye in exchange for greater power or knowledge, much like Odin in Norse mythology. This act of self-imposed transformation highlights their complexity, showing them as beings capable of both sacrifice and ambition. These alternative interpretations challenge the simplistic view of Cyclopes as one-eyed giants from birth. Instead, they reveal a richer narrative where their single eye could symbolize punishment, divine favor, or even personal sacrifice. This diversity in their mythology reminds us that the Cyclopes were far more than just monsters. They were beings with stories as layered and intricate as the gods themselves. As we continue to unravel the myths surrounding the Cyclopes, let's turn our attention to another aspect of their lore, one that explores their relationships with humans. But more on that next. Now, shifting our focus, let's explore another layer of Cyclopes mythology that often gets overlooked, their interactions with humans. While many of us picture Cyclopes as fierce, human-hating monsters, thanks to tales like Odysseus's encounter with Polyphemus, the reality is far more nuanced. In fact, there are several myths where Cyclopes not only interacted peacefully with humans but even offered them assistance. One such story comes from the lesser-known corners of Greek mythology, where a Cyclops named Achaemon is said to have helped a group of lost sailors. According to the tale, these sailors were stranded on a remote island, and Achaemon, rather than attacking them, provided them with food and shelter. He even guided them back to their ship, ensuring their safe return. This act of kindness challenges the stereotype of Cyclopes as inherently hostile, showing that they could be compassionate and helpful when the situation called for it. Another example can be found in the myth of the Argonauts. During their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece, the Argonauts encountered a Cyclops who lived near the island of Lemnos. Instead of posing a threat, this Cyclops offered them valuable advice about navigating the treacherous waters ahead. His guidance proved crucial to their success, highlighting how Cyclopes could play a supportive role in human endeavors. These stories reveal a more complex relationship between Cyclopes and humans, one that wasn't solely defined by conflict. While it's true that some Cyclopes, like Polyphemus, were antagonistic, others demonstrated a capacity for cooperation and even generosity. This duality reminds us that Cyclopes, much like humans, were capable of a wide range of behaviors shaped by their circumstances and choices. So, the next time you think of Cyclopes as nothing more than savage monsters, remember these tales of their unexpected kindness. Their relationships with humans were far more varied and intricate than popular retellings often suggest. As we move forward, let's delve into another fascinating aspect of Cyclopes' lives, their habitats. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's turn our attention to where Cyclopes called home. While many of us imagine them lurking in dark, damp caves, their habitats were far more diverse than this single image suggests. In fact, Cyclopes were known to inhabit a variety of environments, each tied to their unique roles in Greek mythology. Take, for example, the three Cyclopes, Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges, who were master craftsmen. These Cyclopes didn't live in caves, but instead worked in the divine forges of Mount Etna, where they created Zeus's thunderbolts and other legendary weapons. Their fiery workplace was a far cry from the shadowy caves often associated with their kind, highlighting how their environment reflected their skills and purpose. Another fascinating example comes from the myth of Polyphemus, who, while often depicted in a cave, was also said to roam the rugged mountains of Sicily. These mountainous regions were not just hunting grounds but also places where he tended to his flocks, showing that Cyclopes could thrive in open, elevated landscapes as well. Even more intriguing are the stories that place Cyclopes in divine realms. Some myths suggest that certain Cyclopes resided in the heavens, working alongside gods like HESIOD'S in his celestial workshop. These divine settings underscore their elevated status and the respect they commanded among the gods, challenging the notion that they were confined to primitive or isolated spaces. So, while caves may have been a common setting for Cyclopes in some tales, their habitats were as varied as their roles. From volcanic forges to mountain peaks and even the heavens themselves, Cyclopes adapted to environments that suited their abilities and responsibilities. This diversity in their living spaces reminds us that they were far more versatile and complex than the one-dimensional image of cave-dwelling monsters often suggests. As we continue, let's explore another layer of Cyclopes mythology, their appearances and how they've been depicted over time, but more on that in the next section. Now, let's shift our focus to how Cyclopes were portrayed in art and literature, particularly the myth that they were always depicted as ugly. While many of us might picture Cyclopes as grotesque, monstrous figures, this wasn't always the case. In fact, their appearances varied widely depending on the context and the storyteller. Take, for instance, some ancient Greek pottery and sculptures. While certain depictions do emphasize their single eye and rugged features, others present Cyclopes as powerful and even majestic beings. Their towering stature and muscular builds were often meant to inspire awe rather than revulsion, highlighting their strength and divine connections. In these portrayals, Cyclopes were less about horror and more about embodying raw, untamed power. Even in literature, their descriptions weren't always negative. While Homer's Polyphemus is often remembered as a brutish figure, other myths describe Cyclopes as noble and dignified. For example, the three Cyclopes, Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges, were revered for their craftsmanship and intelligence, traits that elevated them beyond mere physical appearance. Their role as creators of Zeus's thunderbolts and other divine weapons added a layer of respect and admiration to their image, challenging the idea that they were universally ugly. This variation in depictions also reflects broader cultural values. In ancient Greece, beauty standards were deeply tied to ideals of strength, skill, and divine favor. A Cyclops might not fit the conventional human idea of beauty, but their physical traits often symbolized their extraordinary abilities and their closeness to the gods. This duality reminds us that beauty in mythology was rarely one-dimensional. It was about what a creature represented, not just how they looked. So, while the image of the Cyclops as a monstrous, ugly figure has persisted in popular culture, it's important to recognize the diversity in their portrayals. From awe-inspiring artisans to noble giants, Cyclopes were far more complex than the one-note villains we often imagine. As we move forward, let's delve into another fascinating aspect of Cyclopes, their connection to the elements and how their roles evolved across different myths. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's turn our attention to another intriguing myth about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always associated with storms. While it's true that Cyclopes are often linked to thunder and lightning, thanks to their role in forging Zeus's thunderbolts, their connections to the elements go far beyond just storms. In fact, their mythological roles are as varied as the myths themselves, revealing a much richer and more complex picture. For starters, Cyclopes were deeply tied to fire, but not just in the destructive sense. As master blacksmiths, they harnessed the power of fire to create some of the most iconic weapons in Greek mythology. Think about it: Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades's helm of invisibility were all crafted by the Cyclopes. Their skill with fire wasn't about chaos or destruction. It was about creation and mastery, transforming raw elements into tools of divine power. But their associations don't stop there. In some myths, Cyclopes are connected to the earth itself. For example, they were said to have built the massive walls of Mycenae, a feat that showcased their strength and ingenuity. These stories highlight their role as builders and craftsmen, tying them to the stability and permanence of the earth rather than the unpredictability of storms. Even water plays a part in their mythology. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was often depicted as a patron of the Cyclopes, particularly Polyphemus. This connection to the sea adds another layer to their elemental ties, showing that their roles weren't confined to a single domain. What's fascinating is how these associations evolved over time. Early myths often emphasized their connection to storms and thunder, likely because of their work with Zeus. But as stories spread and changed, so did their roles. In later tales, Cyclopes became symbols of craftsmanship, strength, and even wisdom, reflecting the values and priorities of the cultures that told their stories. So, while it's easy to think of Cyclopes as storm bringers, their mythological identity is far more nuanced. They were creators, builders, and even allies of the gods, with ties to fire, earth, and water as well as storms. This diversity reminds us that myths are never static. They grow, shift, and adapt, just like the cultures that tell them. As we continue, let's explore another layer of their mythology, how their roles and relationships with other beings, like the Titans, were far more complex than we often assume. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's shift our focus to another fascinating aspect of Cyclopes mythology, the idea that they were always enemies of heroes. While stories like Odysseus's encounter with Polyphemus might make it seem like Cyclopes were universally hostile to heroic figures, the truth is far more layered. In fact, Cyclopes had a range of interactions with heroes, from outright conflict to surprising alliances and even moments of neutrality. Take, for example, the Cyclopes Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges. These three brothers were instrumental in helping Zeus during the Titanomachy, crafting the thunderbolts that allowed him to overthrow the Titans. In this context, they weren't enemies of heroes, they were allies of the gods, playing a crucial role in shaping the very foundation of Greek mythology. Their actions directly supported the rise of Zeus, who is often seen as a heroic figure in his own right. But their relationships with heroes go even further. In some lesser-known myths, Cyclopes are depicted as neutral figures, neither aiding nor opposing heroes. For instance, there are tales where Cyclopes simply went about their work as blacksmiths or builders, uninterested in the conflicts of mortals or gods. These stories paint them as more complex beings, focused on their craft rather than picking sides in the struggles of others. even in cases where Cyclopes did clash with heroes, the reasons behind these conflicts were often more nuanced than simple villainy. Polyphemus, for example, wasn't inherently evil. He was a shepherd living in isolation, and his violent reaction to Odysseus and his crew was driven by their intrusion and theft. While his actions were brutal, they weren't entirely unprovoked. This complexity challenges the idea that Cyclopes were one-dimensional antagonists, showing instead that their interactions with heroes were shaped by circumstance and perspective. What's more, there are even stories where Cyclopes aided heroes. In some versions of the myth of Perseus, Cyclopes are said to have helped forge the weapons and tools he used to defeat Medusa. This collaboration highlights their role as skilled craftsmen rather than mere monsters, offering a different side to their mythological identity. These varied interactions remind us that Cyclopes, like many figures in Greek mythology, were not defined by a single role or relationship. They could be allies, enemies, or neutral observers depending on the story and the context. This complexity adds depth to their character, showing that they were far more than just obstacles for heroes to overcome. As we move forward, let's explore another layer of their mythology, how their relationships with the Titans were far more intricate than we often assume. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's turn our attention to a particularly gruesome myth about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always depicted as cannibals. While the story of Polyphemus devouring Odysseus's men certainly left a lasting impression, this portrayal isn't the full picture. In fact, the Cyclopes' dietary habits were far more varied and nuanced than this single dramatic tale suggests. For starters, not all Cyclopes were depicted as flesh-eaters. In many myths, they were shown to have more refined diets, focusing on the natural resources around them. Polyphemus, for example, was a shepherd who tended to flocks of sheep and goats. His primary source of sustenance came from these animals, including their milk and cheese rather than human flesh. While his encounter with Odysseus took a dark turn, it's worth noting that his initial reaction to the intruders wasn't immediately violent. It was only after they stole from him that the situation escalated. Moreover, the Cyclopes who worked alongside the gods like Brontes, Stereotypes, and Arges were rarely associated with cannibalism. These skilled craftsmen were more focused on their work in the divine forges, creating weapons and tools for the gods. Their lives revolved around their craft, and there's little to suggest that they engaged in such brutal practices. In fact, their role as creators and builders paints them in a far more civilized light, challenging the stereotype of them as savage monsters. Even in myths where Cyclopes are depicted as more isolated or primitive, their dietary habits aren't always extreme. Some stories describe them as living off the land, consuming fruits, grains, and other natural produce. These depictions suggest that their way of life was more in tune with nature than the exaggerated tales of cannibalism would have us believe. So why does the image of the Cyclopes as cannibals persist? Much of it comes down to storytelling. Myths often rely on dramatic elements to captivate audiences, and the idea of a one-eyed giant devouring humans is undeniably gripping. This exaggeration served to heighten the stakes in tales like Odysseus's journey, making the hero's eventual triumph all the more satisfying. But it's important to remember that these stories were shaped by their purpose, to entertain and inspire, rather than to provide a fully accurate portrayal of the Cyclopes. By examining these myths more closely, we see that the Cyclopes' dietary habits were far more diverse than the cannibalistic stereotype suggests. They were shepherds, craftsmen, and even gatherers, with lifestyles that varied depending on their roles and environments. This complexity reminds us that the Cyclopes, like many figures in Greek mythology, were not defined by a single trait or behavior. As we continue, let's explore another layer of their mythology, how their habitats and lifestyles were far more varied than the cave-dwelling stereotype implies. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's shift our focus to another fascinating myth about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always linked to the underworld. While it's true that some stories connect them to darker, more mysterious realms, this is far from the whole story. In fact, the Cyclopes' associations were far more varied, spanning the heavens, the sea, and even the divine forges of the gods. One of the most well-known Cyclopes, Polyphemus, is often associated with the island where he lived, a place that feels remote and isolated but isn't explicitly tied to the underworld. Instead, his story is more about his conflict with Odysseus and his role as a shepherd, living a life deeply connected to the natural world. This portrayal contrasts sharply with the idea of Cyclopes as dwellers of the underworld, highlighting how their settings and roles could vary greatly. On the other hand, the Cyclopes who aided Zeus during the Titanomachy bronze, stereotypes and arges were closely tied to the heavens. These skilled craftsmen forged Zeus's thunderbolts, weapons of immense power that helped the gods secure their victory over the Titans. Their work took place in the divine forges, often depicted as being located in the sky or on lofty mountains, far removed from the shadowy depths of the underworld. This celestial connection paints them as beings of creation and light rather than darkness and death. Even in myths where Cyclopes are associated with the sea, their roles are diverse. Poseidon, the god of the sea, is sometimes linked to the Cyclopes, particularly in stories where they assist him in shaping the oceans or crafting his trident. These tales place them in a realm that is neither heavenly nor infernal, but somewhere in between, a reminder of their versatility across different mythological narratives. So why does the misconception of Cyclopes being tied to the underworld persist? Part of it stems from their portrayal as monstrous or fearsome beings, which can easily be conflated with the darker aspects of mythology. Additionally, their association with fire and forging, particularly in the case of the divine Cyclopes, might have led to some confusion, as fire is often symbolically linked to both creation and destruction. However, their true roles in Greek mythology are far more complex and multifaceted. By exploring these varied associations, we see that the Cyclopes were not confined to a single realm or role. They were as much a part of the heavens and the sea as they were of any other domain, their stories reflecting the rich diversity of Greek mythology itself. As we move forward, let's uncover another layer of their mythology, how their elemental connections extended far beyond the stereotypes, revealing even more about their place in the ancient world. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's tackle another widespread misconception about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always depicted as lumbering brutes, slow and clumsy in their movements. While some stories might paint them as hulking figures, this portrayal overlooks their remarkable agility and skill, particularly when it comes to their craftsmanship. Take, for example, the Cyclopes' bronze, stereotypes and arges, who are renowned for their ability to forge Zeus's thunderbolts. These weren't just simple tools, they were intricate, powerful weapons that required immense precision and expertise. The Cyclopes' work in the divine forges was anything but clumsy. They were master craftsmen, capable of creating weapons that could shape the fate of gods and mortals alike. Their skill in blacksmithing highlights a level of intelligence and dexterity that defies the stereotype of them being slow or inept. Even in their physicality, the Cyclopes were far from the lumbering giants they're often made out to be. In some myths, they're described as swift and agile, moving with a grace that belies their size. This is particularly evident in stories where they assist the gods in battles or large-scale projects, showcasing not just strength but also coordination and speed. Their ability to work together seamlessly, whether forging weapons or building monumental structures, further underscores their intelligence and adaptability. The myth of the Cyclopes as lumbering brutes likely stems from their association with raw power and their often solitary lifestyles. However, this narrow view ignores the complexity of their roles in Greek mythology. They were not just strong, they were skilled, precise, and capable of extraordinary feats that required both physical and mental prowess. By revisiting these stories, we see the Cyclopes in a new light, not as clumsy giants, but as beings of remarkable ability and intelligence. Their contributions to the divine and mortal worlds reveal a side of them that is often overshadowed by their more fearsome reputation. As we continue, let's explore how their elemental connections further challenge these stereotypes, revealing even more about their place in the ancient world. But more on that in the next section. Now, let's turn our attention to another fascinating myth about the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always associated with fire. While it's true that fire plays a significant role in many of their stories, particularly in their work as divine blacksmiths, this connection isn't as one-dimensional as it might seem. In fact, the Cyclopes' relationship with the elements goes far beyond just fire, revealing a much more nuanced picture of their place in Greek mythology. Take, for instance, their role in crafting Zeus's thunderbolts. While fire was undoubtedly a key part of this process, it wasn't the only element at play. The Cyclopes were also deeply connected to the earth, mining the raw materials needed to create these powerful weapons. Their ability to harness the earth's resources and transform them into divine tools highlights a broader mastery of the natural world, not just fire. But their elemental associations don't stop there. In some myths, the Cyclopes are linked to water as well. One lesser-known story describes them as builders of massive stone structures that stood against the sea, showcasing their ability to work with water and stone in harmony. This versatility challenges the notion that they were solely tied to fire, instead painting them as beings who could navigate and manipulate multiple elements with equal skill. Even their connection to fire itself is more complex than it appears. While they are often depicted as working in fiery forges, this fire wasn't just a destructive force, it was a tool of creation. The Cyclopes used it to shape and refine, turning raw materials into objects of immense power and beauty. This duality, fire as both a destructive and creative force, reflects the Cyclopes' own multifaceted nature. By exploring these varied elemental connections, we see that the Cyclopes were far more than just fire wielders. They were masters of the natural world, capable of working with earth, water, and fire to achieve extraordinary feats. This broader perspective not only challenges the myth of their exclusive association with fire, but also deepens our understanding of their role in Greek mythology. As we move forward, let's delve into another layer of their story, how their relationships with the Titans and Olympians further complicate their portrayal. But more on that next. Now, let's shift our focus to another intriguing myth about the Cyclopes, the belief that they were always enemies of the Titans. While it's true that the Cyclopes played a pivotal role in helping Zeus and the Olympians overthrow the Titans during the Titanomachy, their relationship with the Titans wasn't as straightforward as it might seem. In fact, their allegiances and interactions with both Titans and Olympians reveal a much more complex and dynamic picture. To understand this, we need to look back at the origins of the Cyclopes. According to HESIOD'S Theogony, the Cyclopes were the children of Uranus, the sky god, and Gaia, the earth goddess, making them siblings to the Titans. Initially, they were imprisoned by their father, Uranus, who feared their power. It was the Titan Cronus who eventually freed them, only to later imprison them again out of the same fear. This early history shows that the Cyclopes' relationship with the Titans was marked by both kinship and conflict, rather than outright hostility. When Zeus rose to challenge Cronus and the Titans, the Cyclopes sided with the Olympians, forging the thunderbolts that would help Zeus secure victory. This alliance, however, wasn't born out of a simple hatred for the Titans. Instead, it was a strategic move to overthrow a regime that had oppressed them. Once the Titanomachy ended, the Cyclopes continued to serve the Olympians, but their loyalty wasn't absolute. In some myths, they are depicted as independent beings who worked with both Titans and Olympians when it suited their interests. For example, in certain lesser-known stories, the Cyclopes are said to have aided Poseidon, a god who straddled the line between the old Titan order and the new Olympian rule. Poseidon, a brother to Zeus, was also a son of Cronus, and his relationship with the Cyclopes highlights the blurred lines between these divine factions. The Cyclopes' ability to navigate these shifting allegiances underscores their adaptability and their role as more than just pawns in the divine power struggles. This complexity challenges the myth that the Cyclopes were always enemies of the Titans. Instead, it paints them as pragmatic beings who aligned themselves with whichever side offered them freedom and purpose. Their story reminds us that Greek mythology is rarely black and white. It's filled with shades of gray where alliances are fluid and motivations are multifaceted. As we continue, let's explore another layer of their mythology, how their portrayal as monstrous beings often overshadows their more noble and divine qualities. But more on that next. Now, let's turn our attention to a myth that has shaped much of how we imagine the Cyclopes, the idea that they were always depicted as monstrous beings. While it's true that many stories and artworks portray them as fearsome and grotesque, this isn't the full picture. In fact, the Cyclops' image in Greek mythology is far more nuanced, with some depictions showing them as noble, even divine figures. To begin, let's consider the most famous portrayal of a Cyclops, Polyphemus, from Homer's Odyssey. Polyphemus is often remembered as a savage, one-eyed giant who devours Odysseus's men and lives in a cave. This depiction has undoubtedly influenced the popular perception of Cyclopes as monstrous. However, this is just one side of their story. In other myths, Cyclopes are revered for their incredible craftsmanship and their role in shaping the divine order. Take, for example, the three Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. These Cyclopes were not portrayed as brutish or grotesque, but as skilled artisans whose work was essential to the god's power. In HESIOD'S Theogony, they are described as beings of immense strength and precision, capable of creating weapons that even the gods relied on. This portrayal elevates them from mere monsters to indispensable allies of the divine. Artistic depictions also reveal a more varied image of the Cyclopes. While some ancient pottery and sculptures emphasize their fearsome appearance, others present them in a more dignified light. For instance, certain vase paintings show Cyclopes working alongside gods, their single eye depicted not as a mark of monstrosity, but as a symbol of their unique vision and skill. These artistic choices suggest that the Cyclopes were seen as more than just terrifying creatures. They were beings of power and purpose. Over time, the image of the Cyclopes continued to evolve. In later Roman and Renaissance art, they were sometimes portrayed as tragic or misunderstood figures rather than outright monsters. This shift reflects a broader trend in mythology, where creatures once seen as purely evil or grotesque were reinterpreted with greater complexity. The Cyclopes, in particular, became symbols of both raw power and creative potential, embodying the duality of destruction and creation. This evolution challenges the myth that Cyclopes were always depicted as monstrous. Instead, it shows how their image has been shaped by cultural and artistic interpretations, revealing a creature that is as multifaceted as the myths themselves. As we move forward, let's explore another layer of their mythology, how their association with natural disasters has often overshadowed their more constructive roles. But more on that next. Now, let's shift our focus to a myth that has often overshadowed the Cyclopes' more constructive contributions, the idea that they were always linked to natural disasters. While it's true that their immense strength and association with powerful forces like thunder and lightning have led to this connection, their role in Greek mythology goes far beyond destruction. In fact, the Cyclopes were just as much creators as they were forces of nature. To start, consider their most famous contribution, the forging of Zeus's thunderbolts. These weapons, crafted by Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, were not just tools of destruction but symbols of divine authority and order. The thunderbolts were essential in Zeus's victory over the Titans, helping to establish a new era of cosmic balance. Far from being mere agents of chaos, the Cyclopes played a pivotal role in shaping the very foundation of the Olympian order. Beyond their work with Zeus, the Cyclopes were also master builders and artisans. According to some myths, they were responsible for constructing the massive walls of Mycenae, a feat that showcased their incredible skill and precision. These walls were not just functional but awe-inspiring, standing as a testament to the Cyclopes' ability to create enduring works of art. This aspect of their mythology highlights their dual nature, beings capable of both destruction and creation. The association with natural disasters likely stems from their connection to elemental forces. Their ability to craft thunderbolts and their immense strength made them natural symbols of storms and earthquakes. However, this connection was often exaggerated in later retellings, reducing the Cyclopes to one-dimensional figures of destruction. In reality, their role in mythology was far more nuanced. They were not just bringers of chaos but also enablers of order, their craftsmanship serving as a bridge between the raw power of nature and the refined artistry of the divine. Even in stories where their destructive side is emphasized, there's often an underlying theme of balance. For example, while the thunderbolts they forged could unleash devastation, they were also tools of justice used by Zeus to maintain cosmic harmony. This duality reflects the broader Greek understanding of the world, where creation and destruction were seen as two sides of the same coin. By focusing solely on their association with natural disasters, we risk overlooking the Cyclopes' more constructive roles. They were not just forces of nature but skilled artisans, builders, and allies of the gods. Their legacy in Greek mythology is a reminder that even the most powerful beings are rarely one-dimensional. As we move forward, let's explore the final myth on our list, the idea that Cyclopes were always one-dimensional characters. This will bring us full circle, revealing just how rich and varied their roles in Greek legend truly were. Now, let's turn our attention to the final myth on our list, the idea that Cyclopes were always one-dimensional characters. This misconception is perhaps one of the most pervasive, as popular retellings often reduce these fascinating beings to little more than monstrous brutes or mindless villains. But when we dig deeper into Greek mythology, we find that the Cyclopes were far more complex and multifaceted than they're often given credit for. To begin, consider their roles as divine craftsmen. The Cyclopes weren't just strong, they were incredibly skilled. Bronze, stereotypes, and arges, for example, were master blacksmiths who forged some of the most powerful weapons in the cosmos, including Zeus's thunderbolts and Poseidon's trident. These creations weren't just tools of destruction, they were symbols of divine authority and order, crafted with precision and artistry. This alone shows that the Cyclopes were far from simple or one-dimensional. But their complexity doesn't stop there. In some myths, the Cyclopes were also portrayed as allies of the gods, playing a crucial role in the Titanomachy. Without their help, Zeus might never have overthrown the Titans and established the Olympian order. This alliance highlights their strategic importance and their ability to navigate the complex politics of the divine world. Far from being mindless, the Cyclopes were key players in one of the most pivotal moments in Greek mythology. Even in stories where they appear as antagonists, there's often more nuance than meets the eye. Take Polyphemus, for instance. While he's often remembered as the savage Cyclops who terrorized Odysseus and his crew, his story also reveals a more human side. In some versions of the myth, Polyphemus is portrayed as a lonely shepherd, living in isolation and longing for companionship. His encounter with Odysseus is as much a tragedy as it is a tale of conflict, showing that even the most fearsome Cyclopes had layers of emotion and depth. What's more, the Cyclopes' roles extended beyond their interactions with gods and heroes. In some traditions, they were also seen as primordial beings connected to the very fabric of the universe. Their single eye, often interpreted as a symbol of focus or insight, suggests a deeper, almost mystical understanding of the world. This adds yet another layer to their character, challenging the notion that they were merely brutish or simplistic. So why are the Cyclopes so often reduced to one-dimensional figures in modern retellings? Part of the answer lies in the way myths evolve over time. As stories are retold and adapted, certain details are emphasized while others are forgotten. The Cyclops' monstrous traits, their size, strength, and single eye, make them memorable, but these traits often overshadow their more nuanced qualities. By revisiting the original myths, we can see the Cyclopes for what they truly were: complex, multifaceted beings who played a variety of roles in Greek mythology. They were craftsmen, allies, antagonists, and even symbols of cosmic power. Their stories remind us that even the most iconic figures in mythology are rarely as simple as they seem. As we wrap up our exploration of these 25 myths, it's clear that the Cyclopes were far more than the one-dimensional characters they're often portrayed as. Their rich and varied roles in Greek legend reveal a depth and complexity that continues to captivate us today. So the next time you hear about the Cyclopes, remember there's always more to the story than meets the eye. And so, as we bring our journey through these 25 myths to a close, it's clear that the Cyclopes were far more than the one-eyed giants of popular imagination. From their roles as divine craftsmen forging the weapons of the gods, to their complex relationships with both mortals and immortals, the Cyclopes defy the simplistic labels often assigned to them. They were not just monsters or brutes, they were creators, allies, and even symbols of cosmic power. Their stories remind us that mythology is rarely black and white, but rather a tapestry of nuance and depth. We've explored how the Cyclopes were not all giants, not all violent, and not even all one-eyed. We've seen how they worked together, aided the gods, and even interacted with humans in ways that were sometimes peaceful, sometimes tragic. Their portrayal as solitary cave dwellers or mindless cannibals is just one side of a much richer story. The Cyclopes were as diverse and multifaceted as the myths themselves, challenging us to look beyond the surface and uncover the layers of meaning hidden within these ancient tales. So, what does this mean for our understanding of mythology as a whole? If the Cyclopes, so often reduced to one-dimensional figures, can reveal such complexity, what other myths about ancient creatures have we misunderstood? Could there be more to the stories of the Minotaur, the Hydra, or the Sphinx than we've been led to believe? Mythology is a living, breathing tradition, and every retelling offers a chance to discover something new. If you've enjoyed unraveling these myths with us, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Which myth about the Cyclopes surprised you the most? Are there other legendary creatures you'd like us to explore in future videos? Let us know, we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the fascinating world of mythology. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring the stories that shape our world.